Puppy kisses. Everyone around town knew the story about poor old Mrs. May. She lived outside of town on the nearby mountain, surrounded by a thick forest. Because of this, she rarely got many visitors. That being said, she never felt too lonely. That is, until her husband passed away. Now truly alone, poor old Mrs. May grew very sad. Hearing of this, a few good-hearted townsfolk gathered some money together and bought Mrs. May a puppy. They figured that not only would it be great company for the old woman, but once it grew up big and strong, it would make a fine guard dog to keep her safe. Mrs. May was thrilled to receive a puppy, and soon it became her whole world. The puppy went everywhere with her, and did everything with her. Every meal Mrs. May cooked, she always made extra for the puppy, and she always talked to him just like he was a person. The only problem Mrs. May had was that her bed was very tall, and her puppy was very small. He could not jump up on his own, and though Mrs. May could lift him into bed to sleep with her for the night, she feared he might fall off and injure himself while she rested. So instead, Mrs. May got the puppy his very own little bed and tucked it underneath hers. This way, when she got into bed for the night, she could still lower her hand to stroke the puppy, and the puppy would happily lick her hand. This worked fine for several weeks, and little by little, the puppy grew. Mrs. May thought that soon it would be safe for him to sleep on the bed, but for the time remaining, they developed a comfortable pattern. Every night, after getting ready for bed, Mrs. May would climb under her sheets and settle in. While she did this, the puppy would climb into his own bed. After both had gotten comfortable, Mrs. May would drop her hand down and the puppy would lick it. After this, they both would go to bed for the night. One night, there was a howling storm blowing about on the mountain. The lights flickered before going out. Normally, this wouldn't bother old Mrs. May that much, since she didn't really have many electronics requiring power. But tonight was a little different. For some reason, Mrs. May felt very uneasy. You see, all evening, Mrs. May couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. And as the sun set, this feeling only got worse. Even the puppy seemed to be sensing it. He would stare in a direction intently and sometimes start barking, but when Mrs. May went to check, there was nothing out of place. She told herself it was just the storm that had both of her nerves on edge and tried her best to carry on with her day. And so she did. The rest of her evening went just fine, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Thinking that everything would feel better when the sun was up again, Mrs. May decided to head to bed for the night. As usual, she brushed her teeth and washed her face. But unlike usual, the puppy seemed very distracted. At one point, while she dried her face, he sniffed the air and walked out down the hall toward the bedroom. She heard his little nails clacking all the way down the hall and decided he must be ready for bed now. When she got back into her room, Mrs. May climbed into her bed and got comfortable. As usual, she lowered her hand and the puppy licked it. Finally, feeling more at peace, Mrs. May closed her eyes and fell asleep. Some time passed until she was suddenly woken up. She could hear her puppy faintly whimpering. She thought that perhaps he was having a bad dream, so she lowered her hand again to show him that she was there for him. She called out, telling him everything was all right, and he licked her hand. After that, she went back to sleep again. More time passed, and the puppy cried again, louder this time. Again, Mrs. May spoke comforting words and lowered her hand. Again, the puppy licked it, and she tried going back to sleep. By the third time Mrs. May was woken up, she grew very concerned. This time, the puppy was bellowing so loudly she leapt out of bed. Listening closer, Mrs. May realized that his cries were coming from somewhere else in the house. Mrs. May ran down the hallway toward the sound of the puppy's cries until she got to the bathroom door. It was closed up tight. This only stood out to Mrs. May because she very clearly remembered leaving it open. She reached out a hand and opened up the door, and out tumbled her puppy. So scared he was shaking. It was then that Mrs. May felt that same old feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she slowly looked over her shoulder down the hall toward her room. There, she could clearly see the form of a large man climbing out from under her bed. In the dark, all she could see was the glistening from his wild eyes and the shine of his teeth and a big, creepy smile. As he stood up, he whispered to her in a scratchy, low voice, "Don't you know? Humans can lick, too."